Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Ian O'Donnell. Ian O'Donnell is Professor of Criminology at the University College Dublin in Ireland. Previously, he was Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, Research Officer at the Oxford University Centre for Criminological Research and Research Assistant at the University of London. During his time in England, he served as a member of the Board of Visitors for HMP Pentonville and as a magistrate on the Oxford bench. His latest book, Prison Life, Pain, Resistance and Purpose, published by New York University Press, won the 2023 Outstanding Book Award given by the American Society of Criminology's Division of International Criminology. He is co-editor of Incarceration, an international journal of imprisonment, detention and coercive confinement. This interview was conducted on the 3rd of May 2024.
Welcome, Ian O'Donnell, to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you here. You're the first person we interview from Ireland.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining you.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Ian McDowell, for your participation to our podcast. And I will just start right away by asking the first question we always ask to all our interviewees, and it's probably one of the most difficult to answer because there's no definite answer to that. But how would you define criminology as it exists nowadays in Ireland? And you may start from a historical perspective or contemporary perspective. We are very curious to know about the definition of criminology as a discipline in Ireland.
Thank you. So it's a relatively new discipline in Ireland, really only in existence this century. The first Institute of Criminology, I can say a little bit more about that in a few moments, was created in the year 2000. So for me, criminology is about taking a systematic approach to crime, its causes, classification and consequences, a bit like Sutherland's definition from all those years ago. And much of the criminological research in Ireland, virtually all of it in fact, takes place in one of the universities. There are programs now, they're quite widespread across the country.
Okay, it's very interesting to see that many people still refer to the classic definition of Sutherland. So it's, I think, a timeless one, and it really still captures what we are doing as criminologists. Marcelo, you were going to ask?
No, you mean that in the 20th century there was no real development of criminology?
There's very little. It's very interesting. From an institutional point of view, in 1992, I was working in Oxford. I was a researcher there, and we had a visiting fellow from Galway, Tom O'Malley. He's a sentencing scholar, an academic and a barrister. And the two of us set up an Irish Criminal Justice Research Institute at the end of 1992, early 1993. And we had three aims: to engage in empirical research, to create a forum for the exchange of ideas, and to set up a specialist documentation centre. Of course, in the early 1990s, it was more difficult to come by materials than it is today when everything's online. And we hope to have a newsletter, an annual seminar, and so on. We put together an advisory board. So Dan Freed from Yale was on it, Roger Hood from Oxford, Mike Maguire from Cardiff. We had a High Court judge, Paul Carney, as patron. We developed a small membership base, but we couldn't attract any state support. We were invited to tender for one project that didn't come to anything. So the initiative faded away over a couple of years. So that was 1992, 93. And after that, I was writing quite a lot for the Irish Times about the need for criminological research. And there was a particular time in the middle of 1996 when there had been 2 murders in the space of a few weeks. One of a journalist who was driving home from court, and she was a crime journalist, and a motorbike pulled up beside her and she was shot dead in her car. And the other was of a police officer who was shot dead by an IRA unit. And this created a classic moral panic about crime, and Parliament became very excited. There was a raft of new legislation introduced and so on. I was writing quite a lot for the newspapers at that time, arguing for a measured approach, because the crime problem, insofar as we could get a grip of it, wasn't particularly problematic, and there were lots of approaches that could be taken other than prison expansion and enhanced police powers and so on. I wrote a series of these pieces for the Irish Times. One of them was specifically about the need for criminological research and the need for a centre where this kind of work could be carried out. The state didn't respond, but an Irish-American philanthropist, a man called Chuck Feeney, who was hugely generous in Ireland and in other jurisdictions, his team in Dublin read this article, and they came over to me in Oxford, and they talked about maybe he would take the initiative, because the state hadn't, in funding criminology and in creating an institute where criminological research could be carried out. So I worked with them to draw up some proposal documents, and they invited tenders, and various universities pitched for the money. And University College Dublin, where I am now, the Dean, Paul O'Connor at the time, was very enthusiastically supportive of the need for a criminological research institute. They won, and the institute was established there. At that point, I had left Oxford. I was the director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, and Paul O'Connor invited me to join the Institute's inaugural advisory board. So that was the first formal infrastructure, the first kind of Institute of Criminology in the country, and that was in the year 2000. And it was not because the state decided it was time to act, or because the universities decided there was a kind of an area here which needed development. It was because of the generosity of this philanthropist, Chuck Feeney, who gave all his money anonymously. He was an incredible man. There's no building named after him. When he gave money to a university, he didn't want to be recognized. He had a philosophy of giving while living, making an impact with the many billions that he spent during his own lifetime. And the Institute of Criminology in UCD was one of the beneficiaries of his generosity. So it's really a 21st century development in terms of a kind of an infrastructure for research.
It's a completely different history than that of, let's say, the rest of Europe. Huh?
Yeah,
or at least, let's say in Western Europe at least.
Yeah, it's very, very different. There were a few attempts. There was a conference in University College Dublin in 1971 where a small group of people thought that there might be some appetite for a society of criminology. And they convened in the university, and a small number of papers were presented. And they contacted the Department of Justice to see whether there might be some state interest or support for this initiative, and there wasn't. The department was quite dismissive, so it fizzled out. So there was really very little. There were a small number of people in the 1970s and 80s and 90s who were doing research, and some of that research was really good. There was a scholar called Seamus Brannock. He was working in the Dublin Institute of Technology on the police. There was Ian Hart in the Economic and Social Research Institute in the 70s looking at recidivism, crime trends and so on. Paul O'Mahony was a psychologist in the Department of Justice, and he did some very good surveys of prisoners. Kieran McCullough, a sociologist in Cork, wrote the first sociological introduction to criminology and criminal justice in Ireland. Tom O'Malley in Galway was looking at sex offences and sentencing. Dermot Walsh in Limerick was looking at the police. So there were 6 or 7 individuals in the 70s and 80s and 90s who were doing very good work, but they were really pursuing their own interests. There was no critical mass. There was no institution within which they could locate their work.
That's very unlike the continental history. So there was no connection to institutes of law at all? Nothing?
No. And when the Institute of Criminology was established in 2000, it was in the law school in UCD. And the other institutes that have grown up, the other criminology programs, tend to be in law schools as well. But when in 2005 I wrote one of the country surveys for the European Journal of Criminology on Ireland, And in 2005, there was only one full-time post dedicated to criminology. That was the one I occupied. And now there are 4 in my university and probably 20 or more across the country. So it's been a late bloomer, I suppose, the discipline has in Ireland.
Do you think or do you have an hypothesis of why this happened like that?
Yeah, I do. I think for a variety of reasons. The crime rate was very low in Ireland for most of the 20th century. And when Frida Adler wrote her book about nations not obsessed by crime, well, Switzerland was one of them. Ireland was one too. The prison population was very small, right up to the 1970s and 80s. There was very high emigrations. Ireland's unusual in the sense that the population shrank from the 1840s to the 1960s. And by the early 1960s, the population was under 3 million, 2.8 million. Now it's 5.3 or whatever. So there's been considerable growth. And a lot of the crime problem was exported. So even as recently as the 1960s, there were more Irish-born men committed to prison in England than in Ireland. So people were moving out of the country. The crime rate was low. So I don't think there was a huge amount of interest in law and order issues. And that remained the case in the 1980s and 1990s. It was only in 1996, when these 2 awful killings took place in a very short space of time, that public concern about crime spiked. Prior to that, when opinion polls were done and surveys, even in the 80s and early 1990s, public concern about crime was very low. Sometimes 2 or 3 or 4% of the public put crime as their top priority. So it's a very different pattern to other countries.
And do you think that has changed now in terms of the fear of crime in the population?
There are peaks in concern, but I don't think they're sustained. So if you were to do a survey today and ask people, what is the most important issue facing the government? Crime would come very, very low on that list. Housing would probably be at the top. Healthcare would be very high. Migration would be now. Cost of living would be up there. Commuting, easy commutes to work and so on. Crime is very, very low. And myself and a couple of colleagues looked at this a number of years ago, where we looked at all the opinion polls that were done in the run-up to general elections, when people are asked what should be the priorities for the incoming government. And the same kinds of questions are asked year on year, so you can do some meaningful comparisons. And we found that throughout the 1980s, when recorded crime was heading for a peak, people weren't at all concerned about law and order issues. They were concerned about unemployment. They were concerned about emigration. There were no jobs in the country for their children. They were concerned about the troubles in Northern Ireland. So maybe that's something we can come back to. The conflict in the other jurisdiction on the island impacted on people's feelings and concerns south of the border. They weren't concerned about crime. And in 1996, when the journalist Veronica Guerin and the police officer Jerry McCabe were shot dead in the space of a fortnight, people's concerns peaked then, even though the crime rate was declining. And there was a acute concern about crime that had implications for policy and practice. People's anxieties dissipated quite soon afterwards. And again, if you were to do a poll today, I'd be surprised if more than 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% of people said that crime was their number one priority.
So it's incredible also how the country changed in 50 years. You doubled the population. Yeah. You became a country of immigration instead of emigration. That's a huge change during a lifetime.
No, it's a huge change, Marcelo. To think that in the early 1960s, there were 2.8 million people, and now there are 5.3. It's really incredible. And if you go back, of course, to the middle of the 19th century, there were 8 or 9 million. So we're still not back to where we were before the famine of the 1840s. But in the space of a couple of generations, the population has increased very dramatically. Crime and law and order have become, politicized from time to time, but concern isn't sustained in the way it is elsewhere. The number of serious crimes has gone up, and the prison population has increased, and so on.
Yeah, it's quite interesting also that you mentioned you went from 1 professor of criminology to 20. So I suppose this implies that there is also a growth of the number of students.
Very big growth in the number of students. So when the Institute of Criminology was set up in UCD in the year 2000, the plan was that it would be exclusively a research institute. because there was so much remedial work to be done, that was to be the Institute's priorities. But there wasn't much funding available. The state didn't have much money to give out, and the research councils didn't have much. So we decided to put on postgraduate program. We put on a master's program in criminology in about 2008. There was an existing program at the Dublin Institute of Technology that had been running for a long time. It was a diploma and then a master's. The one in UCD was the first kind of university master's program in criminology. And since then, there have been undergraduate programs in University College Cork. There's an undergraduate program in my own university since last year. It's a psychology and criminology program. Most institutions now offer undergraduate and master's programs in criminology and criminal justice. There's been a huge growth in terms of interest from students.
And the approach that is taught in these programs, you have some sort of national program of criminology? Are the studies are authorized by the state in some way?
No, not at all. It really, whatever's offered depends on the interests and kind of inclinations of the staff in the institution. So there isn't a national curriculum as such, and the programs that we offer in UCD would be different to the programs that are offered in Maynooth or Galway or Cork, and they really reflect, what the staff in the institution can bring to the program.
Yeah, that is quite a challenge, I think. It's the same in other countries. That it's called criminology, but the way it's being taught may be completely different from one university to the other. The common curricula.
Exactly. I think this is a very huge challenge, because if you look at the history of the growth of criminological teaching programs, there needs to be a truncus communis, some general kinds of subjects that people need to know about. And of course, each university has the ability to choose and to have some own specializations. But in general, there are several courses that need to be taught: introduction to methodology, introduction to psychological, sociological models, and then you can have your own specialization, especially when there's an evaluation of the activities of professors and of programs. So the uniformity, that's maybe an issue for the future. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it'll come, Lieven, because we're only talking about master's programs that have been around for 15 years and undergraduate programs for about 10.
Okay.
And when the programs were established, there were very few people in the country who could teach on them. So there wasn't a pool of people the only people who had postgraduate qualifications in criminology had gone abroad to acquire them. So I went to Cambridge, other people went to different places. So there wasn't a pool of people who were qualified to take up the posts. There is now, and there's great interest in them, but we're still evolving.
I wonder if that wouldn't be something to be done to have a kind of basic European curricula of criminology. What should be the minimum that a program of criminology should have? Because sometimes it can get heavily politicized, and then you have people talking in different languages in the same conference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened yet in Ireland, because the scale has been so small until recently that it was possible to know everything that was going on. There were a small number of people working in the area. The number of books and articles was modest enough. And if you took an interest and it was your occupation, you really would know what everybody else was doing. That's changing quite quickly with the number of scholars involved growing. And there's not as much specialization as elsewhere. So somebody might take an interest in crime trends and victimization. They might also have an interest in sentencing, or maybe some historical approaches to crime and justice. So people were more generalist, and there was less in the way of a kind of a corpus of work to master. So if we were having this conversation 10 years down the road, maybe there'd be twice as many professors as there are now, and the volume of work would be so vast that it would be just impossible to keep on top of it. And we'd need then the kind of uniformity that you're talking about, or some kind of more systemic approach to teaching and delivering the content. But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, what we've been trying to do in the podcast is to get these persons that represent the origin of criminology in different countries. And it's true that it is possible for the 20th century and now the beginning of the 21st century. But in 20 years from now, if you have to take someone from the current generations, the pool is very, very large, and I think there is a sort of, but this is my opinion, then I would like to know yours. But the society gets fragmented because of the way in which circulation works, the social networks, and also the field gets fragmented, the criminological field. And one thing that is surprising for me is that 20 years ago, a major issue in a conference was the plenary sessions. Who are we going to invite to the plenaries? And now you can have a huge conference and the plenaries are not well attended. And people stay in groups. Like, for example, in the European Society of Criminology, there are more than 30 groups. And they remain inside their groups. Yeah. And this is a different development. So perhaps at the level of Ireland, it's not yet the case. But probably these people have their international connections and they're getting into these sub-networks too.
Yeah, I think that's true at an international level, but we have a conference, a criminology conference in Ireland nearly every year. Yeah. It's called the North-South Conference, so it includes, there are two jurisdictions on the island, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and this conference involves people from both sides of the border. And it started in 2005, the first one was on in Belfast, and in June of this year, 2024, the 15th one on in Belfast. And the conference moves around. So we've hosted it in UCD 3 times, and it moves then to another university in North and South, and everybody gets involved. And probably now there'd be, maybe the last one was in Dublin City University last year, maybe 140 delegates or 120 delegates. And people come to all the sessions. And there might be 2 or 3 parallel sessions. And they're all very, very well attended. And the other thing that's interesting about it is, and this is to some extent a reflection of the scale of the jurisdiction, in a small country it's possible to get to a meeting like that, the director generals of the various services, the people who you'd like to hear the outputs of the research you're working on. So to get the director general of the prison service there, and the director general of the probation service, and the commissioner of the police, and maybe the Minister for Justice or a Minister of State in the Justice Department, it's perfectly possible to get all of those people into one meeting. So people tend to go, and the scale of it is such that you couldn't really specialise. Maybe you'd have to go to the ESC meeting for that, or the ASC. But our North-South Conference, the model is that there's a steering committee that changes. It's very informal, but it's successful. There's no Society of Criminology. There's just a group of people from the different universities. And at the conclusion of each conference, somebody volunteers to take the next one. And the mailing list and so on are handed over, and they come up with the program. There's never been a charge, a registration charge, because we want to make sure that early career researchers can go. And it's been a great success. And in the early days when we were doing this, in 2005-06, we wondered whether there should be a Society of Criminology that would run the conference, but there just weren't enough people to, if you have a society and it has to have a legal foundation, and you need directors, and you need a company secretary, and you need to make their own reporting requirements and annual returns, and the scale of the operation didn't justify that kind of work, and there was nobody really there to shoulder it. So we decided, without having the society, people could join the British Society or the European Society, but that it would be very important to keep the conference going and to involve people from North and South and to move it around the different universities in the country. And that's happened pretty much every year, interrupted by COVID, of course, like everything else, for nearly 20 years.
And well, there are two things there. One is the relationship North-South, but perhaps before going there, as you mentioned that you have the director generals participating, do you see, maybe it's too early now, but probably the students that you are producing, let's say, or they will get to these positions. And how is the relationship with the current director generals, let's say?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think we've had people who come from on our master's program in UCD, we've had people who come from the Department of Justice to enhance their skills by doing a master's. And we've had senior people maybe in the paroling authority and so on who've done that too. Some of our graduates will end up, I suppose, over the course of, over a number of years as judges and, senior policymakers. The relationships are pretty good in the sense that there's an openness to dialogue, but what's really a kind of a problem is the lack of any commitment to provide the kind of funding that's necessary to do work on a meaningful scale. So yes, it is possible to, I've been invited, I was doing some work on how prisoners cope with solitary confinement, and the Director General of the Prison Service invited me along to talk to all the prison kind of managers about the issues that come out of the research. So that kind of thing would happen, or if colleagues are working in probation, the Director General will be keen to know, what's going on in terms of their research. And there's an Irish probation journal, and they'd be keen to be publishing the findings of kind of academics alongside those of practitioners. So because the country is small, it's possible to connect. And although there isn't a Society of Criminology, there's another organisation that acts as a kind of an umbrella group for people who have an interest in criminal justice. It's called the Association for Criminal Justice Research and Development, and that has annual meetings, and they take place under the Chatham House rules, so remarks that people make can't be attributed to them afterwards, in order to promote, robust exchanges of views. And at those meetings, again, all of the senior people in the different agencies would be present, and academics and practitioners too. So it's possible to get access to people, but what's a bit frustrating is that the funding base doesn't yet exist to allow those conversations to be based on, good quality empirical research.
I've seen this Irish Journal of Probation because once I was invited to Dublin to talk about that. How that happened, this development of probation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting initiative, and it must be going now nearly 20 years. It's north-south again. So it's a collaboration between the Probation Board of Northern Ireland and the Probation Service in the Republic. And its editors come one from each side of the border. And there's a kind of an advisory board. I'm on it, my colleague Deirdre Healy, I think Fergus McNeil in Glasgow, various other people are on it too. And they work very hard to solicit material. And there's a kind of an annual lecture that the Association for Criminal Justice Research and Development do every year. That's always published in it. They have book reviews, and they've done very well in keeping it going, because the probation estate is quite small, and it's a good journal, and it's coming out on time every year, for maybe 18 or 19 years.
Oh, it's quite incredible. Yes, I've seen it, and funny that a specific field, probation, gets its journal. It's quite amazing. And there is also another thing about talk about probation. You mentioned prisons before. I remember reading an article that you wrote a few years ago. There was one remark about the role of religion in prison, and I remember that you mentioned, because, for example, for the space statistics, we never use the 31st of December or the 1st of January, because in many countries there are leaves for the prisoners to spend the Christmas and New Year. Now people say holidays, but in Catholic countries, or countries that used to be Catholic, you were celebrating this feast. And you mentioned that this was going down. So I guess this is also related to the role of religion in society, and that may be interesting even in terms of I don't know if the religion institutions were quite important in Ireland. Even I suppose they should probably play the role also in prisons, no, for rehabilitation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And there was a tradition until relatively recently that at Easter and at Christmas, the department would be very generous in terms of granting early release to prisoners. And in 1932, when the Eucharistic Congress came to Dublin, there were lots of prisoner amnesties. And in 1979, when Pope John Paul II came to Dublin and everybody in the country went to the Phoenix Park, about 1 million people, to hear him say Mass, it was very interesting. I had a look at the Department of Justice archives, and they wanted to mark the occasion by showing clemency to prisoners. But there was a practical consideration, which was that they couldn't grant release when the Mass was on in the Phoenix Park in Dublin, because every house in Dublin would be unattended, and that might backfire. So they decided to hold off a little bit. That's changed a little bit in recent years, and ministers have become a little bit anxious about Christmas releases. And I don't understand why, because there was never any difficulty with them. And the prisoners, if they got a few days, they always came back. And if they didn't come back, they were usually at their, family home. It was easy to get them. It wasn't a controversial policy. It didn't attract much media attention other than a small sidebar in the newspapers saying 120 prisoners were granted, release for Christmas. The Easter release is completely gone now. And the Christmas release, the state is taking a much more kind of parsimonious approach to it. And I think that's unfortunate. On the religious thing, chaplains are still very important in prisons. But I think it's fair to say one area that I've been interested in for a number of years is the area of coercive confinement. So thinking of social control, not just in terms of prison, but in terms of all the other places where people were deprived of their liberty. And Owen O'Sullivan in Trinity College Dublin and myself have been looking at this for the last 20 years or so, and we're talking about reformatory schools for children, industrial schools, psychiatric hospitals where people are detained against their will, Magdalene laundries, homes for unmarried mothers and their children, and so on. And the church was involved in lots of those institutions, not the psychiatric hospitals, but in the institutions for women and children. And the last 20 years have seen huge concern about the legacy of those institutions and a real awareness of the harms they caused. And the public view of the church has taken a huge battering as a result of a whole series of reports into what life was like in these religious institutions, religious-run institutions. So I think the role of the church in prisons has changed, pretty dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years. And even the chaplains today, most of them are lay people. So there was a very interesting documentary. There was a really interesting documentary made in the 60s in the St. Patrick's Institution, which was the young offender institution in Dublin. And the documentary was made by a team of priests. And when they went into the institution, the key people were with the chaplains. And that's totally changed. So chaplains now tend to be lay people, and they're employees of the Department of Justice, etc. So there's been real movement in that area.
That's Ireland being a small country in terms of population is a very interesting case story to tell, because, for example, you see in some countries, Brazil, Argentina, the evangelistic movement is having, for example, some buildings in some prisons are given to one of these churches, and they take care of that. They have their own system of discipline, and it's a huge change, But you need a comparative research to do that. Yeah, I think it was important to talk about this when we're talking about Ireland. This huge change. Even I suppose in institutions for minors, it was probably also Catholic institutions, no?
That's been one of the most remarkable changes in Ireland over the last 50 or 60 years has been the disappearance of institutions for children where they're coercively confined. So in the 1960s, there was an industrial school in Dublin. It had 800 boys in it, 800. Now we have no children in prison. We had the St. Patrick's Institution, we shut it down. So there are no children in prison. There is a secure facility run by the Department of Education, and it maybe has 25 or 30, mostly boys in it, occasionally a couple of girls. That's it. So if you were to look at the scale of coercive confinement in Ireland from the 1950s to the present, you'd see a huge decline in the number of children in these institutions, the virtual disappearance. It's quite a story.
I think that would be interesting to tell, and maybe you can compare with Canada, because Canada also went through, especially Montreal, let's say Quebec, the French part of Canada. There was a big institution called Boscoville. I remember Maurice Cusson made his PhD probably on that, and they made an evaluation. Apparently it exists again, Boscoville for Don Bosco.
Yeah.
But it's a huge change in the approach to rehabilitation that I think could deserve some work.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the massive deinstitutionalization of the country over 50 or 60 years. When you look at the psychiatric hospital population, that's shrunk. The institutions that were there to hold women and their children, they've all gone. Now that's relatively recent, but it's dramatic.
These are good topics for PhD dissertations. Yeah.
Very interesting development, because it's the object of a huge debate. For example, in the Nordic countries, there's a huge discussion about the consequences of no longer having these institutions. People are scared because of the fact that people are on the streets and afraid of being attacked and so on. So because of some exceptional cases, for example, a decade ago, there was a Swedish minister who was stabbed to death because of a person who was supposed to be in one of the mental hospitals, but who wasn't, and that changed a lot, and there was a dramatic increase in fear of crime as well. So interesting to see that the situation is not like that in Ireland. So
yeah, and when you look at the numbers, Lieven, if you think of, say, of coercive confinement, so of the psychiatric hospitals where people were held against their will, not the voluntary patients, the involuntary ones, and these other places I've mentioned, and go back to the 1950s when the crime rate was very low and the prison population was only a few hundred. 1% of the population were coercively confined. 1%. That's more than the United States during the peak of mass incarceration. So there were a lot of these, and those institutions weren't uniquely Irish. So they're found, as you say, in Nordic countries, various residential schools for children. The mother and baby homes and the laundries and so on are found in many countries. Marcelo mentioned Canada, also Australia, and so on too. So there's a really interesting job of work to be done, seeing to what extent the levels of coercive confinement have changed in different jurisdictions and what factors have been driving that.
And this happens in a period when your population is growing.
Yeah.
And growing at a very high speed. But this increases, I don't know, Irish people that came back, a sort of baby boom, immigration, or a mix of all that?
A mix of all that. Initially, Irish people coming home. So when the economy improved, so when I graduated in 1988, I studied in Dublin, in Trinity College Dublin. There were 30 people in the class. I think 2 of them stayed in Ireland. Everybody else emigrated. And 9 years later, I returned. So lots of people came back when there were opportunities for them to return. And then because the country is doing so well economically, it was attractive to other EU citizens to come and work there. So I think it was maybe 120 or 130,000 people moved from Poland to Ireland and settled very well. And so there's been a lot of returning Irish people who came back because there were opportunities, a lot of people who moved from other EU countries, and then migration from further afield too. So a real kind of mixture of those factors.
This is a huge change. There are other countries or cities that are. I was saying, for example, I was reading about Barcelona. They had 1% of foreigners in 1990, something like 5 in 2000 when I went to teach there in Spain. And now they have 18% or something like that. And this happened in a very small period of time. And so you mentioned that this could be probably one of the issues that worries people.
I think it's a really big issue, and I think something like 13 or 14% of the Irish population now was born outside the country. And there was a very interesting study done of prisoners in the mid-1990s, and 99% of them were Irish born, and the few who weren't tended to be from Irish families that had lived in England and come back. It was literally, it was a survey of 108 prisoners, and I think 3 of them weren't Irish born, and of those 3, 2 had been born in the UK to Irish parents. If you went into Irish prisons today, you'd find a completely different picture. Maybe 1 in 5 committals is foreign born, so things have changed very, very quickly.
This is a very interesting field of study. And the other question that I think is interesting that you mentioned also before is the relationship with the other jurisdiction, with Northern Ireland.
Yeah, it's a kind of a fascinating one. The troubles, the conflict in Northern Ireland spilled across the border from time to time, and that had implications. So, for example, when I was a student in the mid-1980s, people were still being sentenced to death in Ireland because we didn't abolish the death penalty in 1990, and the people who were being sentenced to death were sentenced to death for paramilitary crimes where a police officer was killed. So in 1964, the death penalty was abolished for all murders except police, prison officers and diplomats. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, the IRA killed, and other Republican groups, the British ambassador to Dublin and police were killed in the context of robberies and so on. So that was an influence, and that impacted on our courts. We have a special criminal court with no jury, 3 judges to deal with these kinds of subversive cases. It had an impact on the Department of Justice, which was quite secretive and inward-looking, because the police force dealt with crime and security. They dealt with both of those issues, and there was a real threat to the existence of the state in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, when there were hunger strikes in the prisons in Northern Ireland and huge protests south of the border. So these things had an impact. Even though the conflict was concentrated in Northern Ireland, there was a spillover, and there was a border. So borders create opportunities for all kinds of criminal conduct too.
Yeah, I remember the British ambassador was killed in Dublin. Eh?
He was blown up coming from his house, very, very close to University College Dublin. Marcelo, you've been there. Very close to there, in his car.
In the car.
Yeah. Ewart Biggs was his name, and his secretary, and I think one other person in the car too. It was horrendous, a huge explosion.
Yeah, of course, there is this link with ETA in the Basque Country. There was also these people going to France. Yeah. And these are 2 different countries, while Ireland is one ethnic group. I mean, it's completely different, the situation. Eh?
It's different. So most of the conflict was concentrated in Northern Ireland. So most of the prisoners who were involved in it were held up there. That there's a kind of a complicated story about the way they were dealt with. But we had one prison, a high security prison, where the army were on the perimeter of it. Where the subversive prisoners, as they're described, were held. There are 6 or 7 of them still there today, but in the 70s and 80s there were quite big numbers, and some of them, if they'd been sentenced to death, there was no way they were going to be executed. Of course the sentence was going to be commuted, but they were held awaiting the commutation of their sentence in this high security prison. They were dealt with in a juryless court. So there are aspects of our system that reflect what was going on across the border.
And this had an impact on research on terrorism in Ireland.
Well, I suppose there was so little research going on at the time. It probably didn't. There were a small number of people, I suppose, who would have taken an interest in policing, would have been concerned with these kinds of issues. But when these problems were at their peak in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was no criminological research as such being carried out.
Yeah, because it's a pity. It's similar what happened in Spain. There were a couple of persons doing research because it would be interesting to compare this with terrorism nowadays, which has a completely different profile. Yeah, there are not a lot of there's not a lot of information about that.
There's a lot about in Northern Ireland. Many of the Republican prisoners did PhDs in prison. When they came out, they became members of Parliament and very active in community life and so on. We have that to a lesser extent in the South because we didn't have as many incarcerated, but they were viewed very differently, treated very differently in prison, and behaved very differently post-release.
And Belfast, if I remember well, they have a criminology degree, or at least a criminology class.
In Belfast?
Yeah,
they have very well developed, Marcelo, in Belfast. They have an Institute of Criminology in 1995, and they have a good group of people. Shad Maroon is there, Kieran McAvoy, Graham Ellison. There's a good group of people there who've been working away for quite a while, and in the University of Ulster too. So both of the universities up there have established criminology programs.
So they started before, probably, at least 5 years before you started in Ireland.
And they would have had some interest even earlier than that, because being part of the UK, there would have been some scholars coming over from England to see, what was going on in another jurisdiction that was part of the United Kingdom.
Well, that's an interesting story. And so you were mentioning that nowadays you have 20 professors and programs in criminology in how many universities?
So I'd say we have 7 universities, and then we have technological universities that they're relatively new. We have 5 more of them. So I think of the 7 universities, there would be well-established criminology programs, undergraduate and postgraduate, in University College Dublin, in Maynooth University, and in University College Cork. and there's a centre for victims, I think, in human rights in Limerick, and there's a programme in Galway too. So probably 5 out of the 7 would have programmes. And I just estimate in UCD there are 4 staff of different levels, you know, lecturers and associate professors, and so on. In Maynooth, probably a dozen, a couple in Galway, and maybe a half a dozen down in Cork. So I reckon 20 or so. And these are people whose exclusive job is criminology. In the past, there were people, there's a very old professorship in Trinity College Dublin called the Reid. It was set up in 1888 as the Reid Professorship of Penal Legislation or something, and then became the Reid Professorship of Criminal Law, Criminology and Penology. But it was called a professorship, but it was for a practicing barrister who was a lecturer. So it wasn't a senior post within the university. So what's different today is the people who have these jobs are criminologists. So the people that were working in the past, Paul O'Mahony, who I mentioned, who did the survey, he was a psychologist in the Department of Justice. Other people were maybe, you know, lecturers in criminal law who took an interest, or lecturers in sociology who were developing an interest in kind of deviance and social control and so on. Today, the 20 or more are employed as, you know, lecturers, professors and so on of criminology.
You know, some countries like, for example, Spain and Portugal, they are seeing a growth of private universities. Is this a phenomenon that exists also in Ireland?
Yeah, we have a very small number, but they're very small. They're small in scale and in number. But most of our universities are all public, state-funded. But there are a tiny number of private institutions, and they offer a limited range of courses, but it's not a meaningful scale.
Yeah, because I have seen this developing, and sometimes they teach the classes in English. There is a market there, and some are giving criminology courses too. It's like a new phenomenon. And as we started saying that there is no common curricula, then if you have public universities plus private universities, it would be quite difficult to know what is going on. And do you think the research, even if it's recent, is having an impact on criminal policies, on how crime is dealt with?
I think it's difficult to say. I've noticed in the last 10 or 15 years a much greater openness on the part of the Department of Justice and the various criminal justice agencies to engage. In the 1970s and 80s and early 90s, there was a reluctance to engage. So that's definitely changed. And there's certainly an openness to the ideas that criminologists would generate. Whether there's an impact on policy, in the youth justice arena, I think there certainly has been. We don't have young people in prison custody anymore, for example. There's an appetite for restorative justice that, you know, there's been some very influential work done. Even a movie made, one of my colleagues, Marie Keenan, who did some restorative justice work with a woman who'd been the victim of rape, and created a situation where she and her and the perpetrator came together when he'd finished his prison sentence, and a film was made about it and shown in cinemas and so on. That's been quite impactful, and there was a National Commission on Restorative Justice, but there isn't follow-through in a lot of those kind of cases. So there's an openness to the idea, and maybe a commission is set up and findings and recommendations are made, but we don't yet have a critical mass of people to ensure that there's a sustained approach to implementation. I think that's what's missing.
But the image that is reflected, at least with the role of probation, also the rate of prisoners in Ireland is a reasonable rate, let's say, if one can say reasonable, but compared to Europe, and very similar to the one in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, the rate is low, yeah.
And completely different from what happens in the island of Great Britain.
It's increasing quite rapidly. So you're right to say that if you looked at it, there are nearly 5,000 people in prison today. So as a rate, with our population 5.3 million, it's maybe 95 or something like that. Much, much higher in England and Wales and Scotland. But it's going up quite quickly, and that's a kind of a cause of concern.
But in any case, the policies of your big neighbors there did not have an impact, a negative impact in Ireland.
Oh, it's a really interesting phenomenon. So we're a colony, the first British colony, and it's interesting if you look. So, for example, probation. The probation service in Ireland the legislation is the 1907 Probation Act, which 1907 advise, assist and befriend. I think it's a fantastic sentiment, you know, for a probation officer to see that as their role. So we're still operating under legislation. And I remember in 2007, there were conferences in England bemoaning the fact that probation had changed so much and this old legislation was gone, and look where they were. So it's still our kind of statute. And other interesting things have happened. So we haven't become, the law and order debate hasn't become as hotly politicised as in England and Wales. That's definitely the case. And we've had awful crimes and there have been peaks of interest, but they've dissipated. The prison population hasn't gone in the same direction as in England and Wales at all either. So we have been insulated from those kind of chill, punitive winds, if you like. And the prison population is modest. It's increasing, and that's a cause of concern. We have imported legislation, of course, from England and Wales, community service and so on, we just copied. But there are interesting and significant differences.
Yeah, now this is, I mean, for me, it's quite impressive to see these differences. And also people are proud of these differences.
Yeah.
They are all positive, yeah.
I think it's a question of scale to some extent too, and particularly with prisons. When the prison population was small and the prisoners were quite well known to the governors of the institutions, decisions about release and risk and so on were made in a different way. When the prison population is getting bigger now, it's more complex and not everybody speaks English. There are a variety of languages spoken, and it's much more difficult to manage an environment like that.
And in terms of research, is there a specific paradigm that is being used, or is there a mix of different ways of studying crime and the social reaction?
Yeah, I'd say it's fair to say that there's a mix, because a lot of people have come into the scene quite recently, and they're pursuing their own kind of individual interests. If there was one kind of a theme, I suppose, research is critical in the sense that people are aware of social inequality and its role in the kinds of creating the kinds of crime that the system is interested in. There's been some work done in the area of situational crime prevention, of course, as there would be in other jurisdictions, but I think it's pretty eclectic and people follow their own interests, their own kind of disciplinary interests. And we don't have, another thing that they have in the UK that we don't have a research excellence framework where people are encouraged to produce the kind of work that leads to the kinds of outputs that can be scored and counted, and then that determines the funding that goes to the institution. We're free of those kinds of constraints, and that gives people a little bit more scope when it comes to deciding the kind of work that they think it's important to do.
Yeah, so you did, well, of course, it's recent you didn't have these debates between criminologists from different sides. Yeah.
No, we sometimes think when we're talking to the students about the kind of the demise of the rehabilitative ideal and so on, and the huge debates that were raging in the 70s and early 80s, because we had nobody teaching or working in the field at the time, it kind of passed us by, I suppose, to some extent.
Yeah, of course. And if you think about the challenges for criminology now, so you mentioned prison population raising. Are there any specific topics you think that are important?
Definitely. I think challenges, I think, are around data, and there are still big problems with data. So there are concerns about the quality of the police data. And the police data are now published by our Central Statistics Office, but until last year they were published under reservation, which meant that the statisticians weren't satisfied that they met an appropriate quality standard. So there are real concerns about the quality of the data. And then there are real concerns about data linkages. So connecting the police data to the courts data, and collecting the courts data, connecting it to the prisons and probation data. So it's impossible to take a longitudinal perspective, or even to track one set of cases through the system to the point of disposal. So that's a real problem. And then there's a real problem with funding. So there is some money available today. The Department of Justice has a research and data analytics department, and they make small grants. But I've been saying to them for years, I'm not the only one, anybody who's taken an interest in this, that they've got to scale up their ambition in terms of funding and in terms of the duration of the projects that are commissioned. So there have been a number of desk-based, state-of-the-art literature reviews and so on. And they're helpful. They're certainly helpful to policymakers. But in terms of funding big empirical studies where you need to put people out in the field for several years, there's no appetite to take on those kinds of costs. So challenges for the discipline are the data deficits, which we still haven't overcome, the level of funding that's available to do ambitious research, and I think potentially heavy teaching loads for people who are in institutions where the undergraduate programs are very popular and there are lots of staff, but they can be really, fully occupied teaching and assessing and doing all of the stuff that, accompanies putting on undergraduate programs. So a growth in numbers at the teaching level, I don't think necessarily is going to, be reflected in an increased volume of research, and particularly when you take account of the data deficits and the funding environment. So I think they're kind of challenges to navigate over the next little while.
And do you have a victimization survey, a national victimization survey?
The Central Statistics Office does one every few years, and that's they take it's a random sample. And when they're doing household surveys, they have a crime and victimization module. And we have been part of the ICVS too.
Yeah, I remember you in the ICVS. That's why I was asking if there was something else, because that also is a good indicator of how things are changed. Of course, now we were looking at research from Finland that showed that 50% of the people surveyed were afraid of being victims of an e-crime, a crime online. Yeah. And this, I think, is also a big challenge for the way in which we teach. I don't know if you have thought about that, because I think it has an impact on the number of students attending classes, especially after the pandemic. But also, of course, in the way in which crime is being committed. It may have an impact on theories and how we apply them, and also on the reaction to that kind of crimes.
Yeah, there's definitely an increasing awareness of that. And last year, our National Health Service, our entire health service computer system was taken over by, I think, compromised by Russian hackers or something like that, and the state was held to ransom in order to get it back. So there's a realization of the vulnerability of these kinds of systems, and I think the government is doing a lot to encourage people, particularly when it comes to banking. Increasingly, banks are being shut down, particularly in rural areas, and people are a little bit concerned because they were confident going into the bank and dealing with a human being. They're a little bit less confident going online and doing the business. So we're reminded constantly of the kinds of information that the banks will legitimately request, and to come up with passwords that aren't PASSW0RD and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And you have a big countryside population in Ireland, because Dublin, of course, is a huge city, but it's a big country, and of course these people, of course they could follow classes online, but also what you mentioned, some institutions are disappearing. The small branches of banks, for example, as you said, they are disappearing nowadays. The University College of Dublin, for example, you only have one campus in Dublin.
Yeah, we used to be scattered a little bit, but everything is on that campus now. Yeah, so everything is there. So the School of Medicine used to be in the city centre, and the veterinary school used to be somewhere else, but they're all concentrated on that campus now.
Yeah, and so in other regions of the country, people will need to come to Dublin and study there.
Yeah. So we of course, during COVID, people could stay where they were. We did everything online, but now we're back to face for pretty much everything.
Because some universities are encouraging a lot the online classes, because of course you don't need to increase the size of your campus, and you get more people, and if you get more funds, of course.
I think our students would like it, because one of the problems with Dublin is the cost of accommodation is very, very high, and the supply is very limited. So students now find themselves unable to afford to live in Dublin, and that means that they can be commuting very, very long distances every day. And I think if they had a choice and they weren't from the capital, they would opt to do more online than they do at the moment, because there's a real cost of living crisis in Dublin, and students every year find themselves completely priced out of the available accommodation, and that's a huge pressure. And the public transport isn't great outside the capital, so they can be driving long distances every day and trying to find somewhere to park and doing their lectures and driving long distances home again. So it's a real challenge, and I think the online learning will be something that will be attractive to them, simply because it would make university education affordable and manageable.
But that will create a huge change in the kind of graduates that we produce.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. They're much better in the seminar room or in the lecture hall together than watching it in isolation on the screen.
No, I was wondering why some universities do not create a campus, outside like, for example, in Belgium. Maybe surely Lieven knows better. When they created Louvain-la-Neuve, when they divided Leuven from Louvain-la-Neuve, they created a university in a city that was rather small at that moment.
Nobody lived there. It's an artificial city, but very lively because of the students, of course. But there's good public transport, so that's, of course, very important.
But nowadays, it's still like that, Lieven. There is no one living really.
Yeah, of course, people live there, but I mean, that's very recently. It's not like a historically grown city.
I thought that could be before the pandemic. I thought that because this issue of the cost of living is a major issue anywhere, and so what you see in some cities, like for example Valencia in Spain, the buildings, the apartments are divided in rooms, and then you rent one room to each student, and then instead of you get much more money from the same apartment. And so I thought, well, this would probably what's going to happen, as some private universities were doing. They will create campuses outside the big cities with places for the students. But now, maybe I don't think this will happen, because the online learning is changing that. So it was an hypothesis that I don't think is going to be corroborated. And I have one more question, perhaps, unless you have something on this issue, Lieven.
I have one other issue, but go ahead.
So you mentioned how the population of the country changed, the prison population changed, and if you think about how crime changed, from what I understood, the crime rate was very low. Which are the main changes there?
There are several. One would be the cybercrime issue that we spoke about. Another would be drugs. That heroin came to Dublin in the 1980s and became a huge social problem. That continues to be the case, and that's generated some criminal organizations that are involved in the drug trade that have feuded, and that can lead to considerable loss of life. And then all kinds of impacts on the prison system, because people who are members of these groups have to be kept apart in custody, and so on and so forth. So the drug crime and the associated issues with it. Another thing that's changed, I suppose, would be an awareness maybe of environmental crime, pollution, waste disposal, that kind of thing as well, is relatively recent. A recognition that corporate wrongdoing can have huge consequences related to, the economic crash that we kind of experienced. And a recognition, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the role of the church and declining kind of confidence in the church, a recognition of sexual abuse and the harms associated with it and the widespread nature of this phenomenon. So I think those are things that, when we think about the crime situation, that have changed over the last 15 or 20 years, that if we went back before the 1980s, people wouldn't have recognized clerical abuse or really child abuse, or considered it as big a problem as it is. There wouldn't have been the cyber crime or the concern about the environment, and the corporate and white collar wrongdoing wouldn't have been a concern either, and the heroin epidemic hadn't begun. So all of those things are concerns now. And even with the heroin problem, there are many people on methadone maintenance. It's very easy to get that there's not a problem, but there still is a hard drug issue in our cities, in the deprived parts of the cities, and that's very difficult to address effectively.
And probably synthetic drugs as well.
Yeah, they're coming in. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, they're coming in, and heroin mixed with other substances that can make it quite dangerously kind of strong for people who are using it, or just dangerously cut in a way that can be fatal.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose also juvenile delinquency, because you have smaller families nowadays. Ireland was a country with big families traditionally, and you mentioned the disappearance of institutions for juveniles. So maybe there's a mix there of people are more conscious about the risk of putting someone in jail, but also there are less young people, no?
Yeah, and there are concerns from time to time, certainly about young people, and it used to be stealing cars, joyriding it was called, car theft and people driving. There was a panic about that for a while. Now it's about young people on scooters maybe supplying drugs for people. So there definitely are concerns from time to time about youth crime, but I think they were greater in the past than they are now.
I had one additional question which interests me very much, because it's a similar problem in Belgium regarding the lack of data quality. I mean, it's one issue to have police statistics and criminal justice statistics, but it's another issue to have high quality statistics, meaning the vertical integration to be able to follow cases through the criminal justice system. And the major challenge there is that at the level of the police, you have some acts of crime which are recorded, but once you go to the level of the prosecution, then you have people who are connected to sometimes different crimes, or people who commit the same crime together and try to, imagine how difficult it is to follow all these decisions throughout the criminal justice system, to know how biased the system is with regard to sentencing. Yeah. And it's impossible to say something about it without being able to track the data throughout the criminal justice system. And we had a large project 20 years ago by my former supervisor, Professor Paul Ponsas, but it's still, a major issue, and it seems like the police forces also don't seem to manage it. But collaboration there between different universities and different institutions would make it possible, I think. But that requires trust, and I don't know to what extent police and researchers do trust each other, because in some countries police want to keep the data to themselves because they mistrust researchers.
Yeah. It's really, I'm sure it's really frustrating. Our police has its own data analysis service now, so they can do some kind of operational stuff for them. But what I find frustrating is that, just like the situation you described in Belgium, it wouldn't be possible to say, well, what is the average sentence for a first-time convicted burglar, or what's the different approach taken to people by age or gender or ethnicity or something like that. We just don't have it. And how many people who are arrested end up being prosecuted? So how does discretion operate at all of these different points along the system? We just don't have the information. So we don't have the quantitative stuff, and then we don't have the qualitative data either. So what does it feel like, to be kind of in court, or to be arrested, or what's life like, on a landing in a prison, etc. So it's an opportunity there for researchers, but the deficits are huge. And maybe it's partly about trust. I think it's also partly about the way the data are collected, because a number of years ago we did a big study of recidivism, and we had fantastic cooperation from the prison service and the police service and the state. It was great cooperation, but it was still very, very difficult to link the data that had been collected by the different agencies, because there was no unique identifier. And the records were made differently. So some people are recording offences and some offenders, and even if you think you're looking at the same set of information, there are spelling errors, different fields are filled in or not filled in, and so on. So even when there was great trust and all the different agencies were handing over their data, it was very, very difficult to make the linkages because of the way the data had been entered. So it's very, very frustrating that in 2024 there are very straightforward questions that we can't even, hazard a guess at the answer.
a huge challenge, I think. I mean, everywhere. I mean, we have data, but we don't know what the quality is. And I mean, these are serious questions regarding the police discretion or discretion at other levels, and we cannot properly answer them. I mean, this is a huge issue nowadays. So let's hope that the situation changes. Also by making people aware of it in our discussion nowadays.
To close this, a little bit the relationship, because I was surprised when we had the conference in Scotland that Richard Sparks, he opened the conference saying we are in Murrayfield Stadium, this place where we had so many wins against our enemy, England. And then I was surprised by the relationships are tense, let's say, inside. And so the UK produces a lot of research in criminology. Which is the kind of collaboration that you have? Do you go to the British Society of Criminology conferences?
That's a really good question. I'd say a number of years ago, when we were starting to organize this North-South conference, we had a discussion about would it be possible to create some arrangement with the British Society of Criminology to include Irish criminologists. And somebody said, well, just like the rugby team is the British and Irish Lions, maybe there'd be a British and Irish Society of Criminology. Now, we were so small and they were so big, that was never going to work. I suspect more Irish criminologists go to the European Society Conference than go to the British Society Conference, and are starting to, and a few go to the ASC. But I think more would go to the European Society Conference and the British Society Conference. But we have good connections. There have been research projects with Scotland and Ireland and Northern Ireland and so on, and good kind of linkages there over the years. And many people who are working in universities in Ireland also worked in universities in the UK. So I worked in Oxford, other people worked in Sheffield, and so on and so forth. So they'd be bringing back established connections as a result of that. And we share the language too. So that makes things, much more straightforward.
No, it was really enlightening, the discussion we had, because, for example, I remember in the 1990s when we started with the European source book, I remember that the representative from the UK insisted a lot in assault against police officers, and at that time I didn't see clearly why that was such a big issue. But then when you mentioned that even in Ireland this was an offense that could lead to the death penalty, of course it's a completely different situation than the ones you can have in countries that do not have a latent conflict there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I learned a lot today. Thank you. Are you having a lot of manifestations in the campuses because of the conflict in Gaza?
Not a huge amount. Then Nancy Pelosi came to University College Dublin to receive an award a few weeks ago, and there were one or two protesters at that, but not a significant amount. There's been some academics have been writing letters to the newspaper trying to encourage the universities to boycott Israel, but so there's a debate, but there haven't been huge protests in the same way that you see in England and in the United States at the moment. Campus occupations, we haven't had that.
Yeah, because in England, I discussed last week, and it's a major issue. In Lausanne, now we have 50 people that were allowed by this is Switzerland, so they discussed with the rector, and so they can stay for the weekend in one of the buildings. And they will not identify, and so they can occupy the building for, let's say, 48 hours. I was curious about what was going on. Okay, so I think we cover almost everything, Lieven, eh?
We covered everything except your final question regarding the influence of or the change of crime during one's lifetime. The additional question you always ask
about the change in their lifetime, but you mentioned more or less that this is because usually we get people, you are younger, you are reducing our average age, which is good, because we made interviews with most people that were already retired, and many of them discuss about these changes, like I remember Roberto Gatti, but I don't remember if he said it in the podcast or in the private discussion. He said when he started going to prisons that in northern Italy, the typical inmate would be someone from the south of Italy who was there for small theft, and this has changed completely nowadays. You indirectly you mentioned that, so I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I would, because I was born in 1966, so I'm glad to hear I'm reducing the age profile.
We are the same. We are the same age.
And in 1966, there were 560 prisoners in Ireland, and 18 of them were women. So we could have decarcerated the female prison population then. We didn't. Today, on the 1st of May 2024, there were just under 5,000 people in prison, and 240 of them were women. So there's been a very substantial increase in the prison population, particularly for women. And if you were to go into a prison today and compare it to a prison even 25 years ago, I think what would be really striking would be the age profile of the prisoners. We have a lot of old prisoners now, and we have to retrofit our prisons to accommodate, wheelchairs and to allow for care assistance and so on. And in a few cases, that's because people are serving long sentences. But more often than not, it's because old people are going into prison, often convicted of offences that took place sometime in the past, and often they're sex crimes. So that's a very, fundamental difference. They were not part of the prison population until fairly recently, and now they really are. And the other thing that you see would be that there are so many prisoners who are not born in this country. So even 20 years ago, even the prison survey that I mentioned that was carried out in the late 1990s, virtually every prisoner was born in this country, and the ones that weren't, their parents were, they all spoke English. And the prison service, of course, had all the problems that prison services do, but communication wasn't one of them. If you went into a prison in Ireland today, went into one of the Dublin prisons today, there could be 10 or 15 languages being spoken there. It's changed a lot. With all the problems that poses for communication and visitation and good order and so on. So to look back over a kind of a lifetime of 40 or 50 years, the first thing would be the huge increase in numbers, particularly marked, I suppose, for the women. And the other thing would be a lot of older people in custody now, presenting all kinds of challenges that they're new, and a much more, mixed population in terms of ethnicity and nationality and so on. So there have been quite fundamental changes there.
Yeah, that is a very good summary of the changes, and I think Ireland is a very nice laboratory. But it's funny that even being an island, you have all these flux of migration. Because Switzerland, of course, we have more than 70% of the prison population are foreigners, and this creates huge problems with the right-wing parties. But you could say, okay, we're in the middle, in the crossroads of Europe. Your position is completely different. Yet some of the problems are similar. So I think we covered everything, and you were very clear in your answer. So Eduardo will not have a lot of work editing this. Eduardo Coco, who does the editing, but it will take some time until you get there. So I wanted to thank you for participating in the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Lieven and Marcelo. It's been great.
We are happy to have Ireland on board. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon, at the latest in Bucharest.
Yeah, I'll definitely see you in Bucharest. Yeah.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Guyot. Your host are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.